You've been one of the most vocal advocates for microdosing.
Yeah.
But in 2022, there's a systematic review that found many of the benefits may just be a placebo. What is your kind of take on that?
Great question. So, the University of Chicago has done some interesting research with Harriet DeWitt, where they provided different doses, like 5 micrograms of LSD, 10 micrograms of LSD, 20 micrograms of LSD, specifically to see its impact on BDNF. And even at doses as low as 5 micrograms of LSD, there was a dose response to the psychedelic. So they were able to show and measure that there was an increase in BDNF. And sort of one of my speculative hypotheses is that a lot of the efficacy of psychedelics comes from their impact on neuroplasticity. So BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, is a precursor to neuroplasticity. And so I think it's interesting that even at these very low doses, we are seeing at least some dose response. Like there is some physiological response with the microdose in and of itself. What I'll often point to as well is there's a clinical research trial that's being carried out in New Zealand right now through a company called Mind Biotherapeutics, where they are doing a naturalistic study of microdoses of LSD, where for, I believe, 6 weeks, folks who are enrolled in this clinical trial for depression are taking LSD home with them. And they're taking about 10 micrograms of LSD twice a week for those 6 weeks. And in that clinical research, they saw a 63% reduction in symptoms of depression, and 52% of people no longer qualified for depression after those studies. So I think
That's
part of the biggest
huge.
yeah, part of the biggest challenge with microdosing right now in terms of assessing, is it placebo, is it not placebo, is the fact that these are still Schedule 1, that it's prohibitively expensive to do research on them. A lot of the research that has been done on microdoses of psychedelics usually just looks at it like done 2 or 3 or 4 times. Typically, people who take the microdose are in like a hospital or a clinic, and they just take it and they're just kind of hanging out rather than going about their normal everyday. And so my bet is that as there is more accessibility to do research, that we'll find more and more clinically significant impacts of microdosing. I think the big distinction though is just going to be, what is the dose level. So another interesting tidbit is in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of research done on what's called psycholytic dosing. So in much of the modern clinical research, the focus is on what's called psychedelic assisted therapy, which is a very high dose of a psychedelic done maybe once or twice with therapeutic support before and after. And the researchers are really measuring, okay, after this one very high dose experience, what shifts and changes as a result of that. Psycholytic research, which was done quite a bit in like Germany and Switzerland in the 70s and 80s, explored, okay, if someone takes a low dose of a psychedelic, not necessarily a microdose, right? I think there is a distinction. Microdosing is typically more subperceptual. These low doses were noticeable and perceptible, but it's not like people were going on journeys and having visions. They were still able to be verbal and communicate and talk through what was coming up for them. And so when they did this once a week in conjunction with talk therapy, they noticed that over the long term, people would experience a lot of the same benefits as just doing one single high dose experience over the long term. And so my focus and sort of the reason I focus so much on microdosing publicly is because since we have an educational platform and I'm openly talking about these, LSD and psilocybin mushrooms, it's more of a harm reduction thing than anything, where I really believe that if people start to come into this work, rather than jumping in the deep end right away, they really should first sort of experiment with these lower doses, kind of get a sense of how it feels, what they notice, what they observe before they're willing to sort of fully jump in the deep end. So I'm not necessarily a guy who believes, you should microdose and you should only microdose. I think it should be an option. And I think for a lot of people who are new to this, it's a great opening or introductory option. But, I still would make the argument that a lot of the more deeper transformative work comes from this sort of spiritual connection that psychedelics elicit, and that spiritual connection is most prevalent when we're working with, 2 tabs or 3 tabs or 3 grams of mushrooms or 4 grams of mushrooms. However, that level of depth requires a lot more holding, requires a lot more preparation, it requires a lot more intention. And I think one of my concerns with sort of where we are at in 2025 now is